The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to Board Engagement for RDO Executive Directors, the third webinar in the NADO Research Foundation's 2018 Professional Development Webinar Series. I'm Ian Schramm, NADO's Database Manager and Membership Assistant, and on behalf of NADO, I'd like to thank you all for taking the time this afternoon to participate in this webinar. Today's webinar, like all of the webinars in the series, is being recorded. In the next day or so, everyone who registered to attend today's webinar will receive a password-protected recorded version. This is the third webinar in the series of professional development webinars that the NADO Research Foundation will be offering until November. Please note the webinar topics were determined with input from the NADO Research Foundation Advisory Committee, NADO and NADO Research Foundation leadership, NADO members, and other regional development practitioners. We will be launching the 2019 webinar series at the end of this year, and we would welcome your input and suggestions for topic ideas. We have 2 more webinars scheduled after this one. The next webinar will cover communication strategies and public relations plans for RDOs. The final webinar will cover crisis communications. For more detail about those webinars and to register, please visit the Professional Development Webinar Series page on NADO's website. Or you could go to www.nado.org/2018 professional development. I'd like to thank Monica Scamardo, founder and president of Variet Consulting, who will be leading today's timely and pertinent webinar. Many of you know Monica, as she has participated in many NADO annual conferences over the past 10 or 12 years. Her sessions are always timely and informative, well-attended, and full of spirited discussions. Monica has worked with various RDO state associations and with many of our partner national organizations. Judging by the slides Monica will use today, we think this will be an informative and very useful session. This webinar has been designed specifically for RDO executive directors. It will offer tips and ideas on what you can do to help your board members fully understand the RDO's programs and services, funding sources, and impact upon and relevance to communities across the region you serve. Monica will address ways to establish a clear definition of board members' roles as the organization's leadership. We think this webinar will be useful for working with both new and long-term board members. Now, before I hand things over to Monica, please note that you can ask questions by typing them in the box at the side of your computer screen. You also have the option, if you'd like to ask a question in real time over audio, to raise your hand by clicking the hand icon that's also in that box at the edge of your computer screen. So everyone is automatically muted during this webinar. If you raise that hand, then I'll be able to unmute you and you can ask your question in real time. I'll also be able to get to questions that you type in if they're relevant at the time. They could also be more general question. We'll leave that to the end for Q&A. And in any case, we will have a Q&A session at the end. Also, as this webinar concludes, you will receive a prompt to complete a brief and easy evaluation. I hope you will take a couple of minutes to do this, as it will help us immensely as we plan future webinars. So thank you in advance for doing that for us. And with that, let me turn the controls over to Monica.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you for all the details and the instructions as well. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for logging in for today's session. We are going to be talking about how you engage your boards. And one of the biggest challenges that I've learned from you all over the years as being a part of NADO is the variety of roles that you play as an executive director. And one of them being the crucial part of engaging your board so that you have meetings and results that are impactful and effective within your communities. And one of the ways to make that happen is, of course, who you have on your board and the relationships you have with them and how they help get results for your communities and for your organization. So I'm looking forward to being with you all today. And like Ian said, I would love for you to jump in on the conversation as we go. Some people are more comfortable on a webinar to sit back and listen, but I want to invite you to jump in, push that raise hand button, and jump in anytime on the conversation. I'll also pose some questions, like Ian mentioned, in real time, in hopes that you all will chime in as we go. I know we have about 9 or 10 people on the webinar right now, and that means we've got 9 or 10 experts plus me and Ian. So we've got a lot of expertise and intel on this call, and I want to make sure we maximize it as best as we can. So please feel free to jump in as you can. So let's jump in and get started with this. The first slide is a little bit of a teaser, but really I want you to look at what kind of board members do you really have. I know that all of your boards are very different. Some of you have smaller boards with 10 people. Others of you may have boards with 30 people. And the challenges around size of board, smaller size versus larger size, they all have different challenges. But what we're going to be talking about today is your overall board, regardless of size, and how you engage not only the board itself, but the individual members of that board. So here's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek slide on asking you to just kind of check out what kind of board members you have. Just for fun, we're looking at across the top, you'll see some of you may conceptualize and see that you have weak board members, okay board members, good board members, and exceptional board members. My guess is that all of you want to have good and exceptional board members. So what we've done in this webcast today is we've pulled together the research that's out there and wrapped it up for you so that you have some very concrete and specific ways to engage your board members. These are some qualities of an effective board. And on this slide, you may just want to look down and see and, put an imaginary checkbox there. Which of these would I say, yes, our board, we have this on our board. We are strong in this area on our board. Hopefully, you can check at least 3 of these boxes. This gives you a picture of where you stand with your board. It also gives you an idea of where you want to invest or engage with your board in a more proactive or in a different way. NADO has done a lot of research and has outlined some of the key roles for board members. And I included this slide because it helps us understand and conceptualize very clearly from a high level what we can or should expect board members to do. But what that really means is what it requires of us as executive directors to do to ensure that our board members can do their role effectively. And that part of what we want them to do on our board is help us establish policy, create partnerships with other communities, with DC, with other organizations, or with other individuals. We also want our boards to really understand our vision. If they understand our vision and we've cast it in a way that demonstrates our passion for it and for what the organization does, then the board member is going to be more supportive and more interested in it themselves if they see us casting it in an interested way. We also want our boards to be involved in the financial integrity of our organizations so that they can help us see, watch, cast, forecast in this area. We want them engaged. We want them to participate. We want them to be a strong face of our organization. We want them to speak of us in our organizations and our impact wherever they go. They touch areas that we don't have the opportunity or the time to touch. And equipping them with the skills, with the information, with the data that they need to talk about our organizations is also very helpful. And I'm going to give you a framework for that as we go through. And then lastly, we want them to be committed to their role and to our organization. Give some thought to, because I'm going to ask you to type in some responses to this question. What are your biggest challenges in engaging your current board members? So if you'll just take a minute to give some thought to that. And Ian, is the best way for them to type their responses into the question spot?
Yes, if they'd prefer, they could also raise their hand, and I could unmute them if they'd like to ask.
Okay.
Audio.
Okay, great. Either way,
Mm-hmm.
Either type in a question or click the raise your hand. We would like to hear what are some of the challenges that your organization has with engaging your board members.
Okay, not seeing any questions or raised hands yet.
Okay, all right, we'll circle back around to it.
Okay. Oh, we just got one. One just came in.
Great.
This is from Carlene Herring. Longtime executive director, recently retired, trying to rekindle board engagement. They're very satisfied with the prior executive director's leadership and organizational direction.
Okay. So they had a good experience, it sounds like, with the previous ED, who's now retired. And so I guess she is now stepping into that role and wants to keep the board engaged. Okay, great. Anyone else? Okay. Great.
We have we have another one from Michelle. I'm sorry, Michelle, if I mispronounced your name. Michelle Bostonellos. Meeting attendance. Get members to show up for meetings on a consistent basis.
Okay. Meeting attendance. Michelle. All right. Perfect. Anyone else? All right. So taking on being the succession of a successful ED is one challenge, and keeping that board engaged with you as the new ED, and then the meeting attendance is what Michelle just mentioned. How to get the board members to not only attend the meeting, but once they're there, get them to show up in a meeting in a way that's valuable to using everybody's time successfully. Okay, great. Thank you. So what we're going to do with the rest of our time on this call, and please feel free to jump in on this because I know all of you have had some opportunity in each one of these areas. What the research tells us about engaging board members is there's 6 key places that as executive directors that we can do that. The first one is onboarding. We're going to go through each of these, but onboarding, communicating the organizational goals, creating a personal site visit opportunity for board members, personalizing your relationship with them. Those of you that have a board of 30 people are probably wondering, how am I going to do that and do my ED job? We'll talk a little bit about that. And then also getting commitments early on from board members, and then again, running valuable board meetings. So let's kick it off with the first one on onboarding board members. Now, I'm sure each of you have a process or have ways that you all onboard successfully. And these are just some additional ways from the research that may be something that you can add to your toolbox. Please feel free during this conversation to type in the best practices that you use, and we'll make sure and share that with the rest of the cast that's online here today. When we're onboarding our board members, some of our board members are serving on more than one board, and they have been asked to be on the board. They need to understand what our organization does. What's the history of our organization? What's our mission? What are we really striving toward, and what do we stand for? One of the things if you can provide them some sort of a handbook, not a 500-page handbook is what the board members would tell you, but some easy access document that would allow them to quickly familiarize themselves with the organization can be very beneficial. And if any of you have things that you particularly like in your handbook or have gotten feedback on for your onboarding handbooks, please feel free to type that in on the questions, and we'll make sure, or raise your hand, and we'll make sure and share those with the rest of the people on the call. The other thing to include potentially is bios of the current board members and of your key staff. It really helps them get to know who's on the board, who they may know, who they may have connections to, what's the intelligence that's on this board and in this organization. If you have a job description, for lack of a better word, for your board members, so just something generic, onboarding and giving them that information, any sort of financial reports or bylaws and annual reports that may help them wrap their brains around the real purpose and of the organization, the impact of the organization. Any calendar meetings, and I'm curious if any of you assign current board members to mentor new board members, and if so, how that's worked for you. So show us a hand if you've done that and you have some expertise that you could share with us. The other thing I'd be curious to hear about, as I'm sure others would, is how you announce a new board member. There's lots of ways to announce it in places and in papers and newsletters and that sort of thing. But to give them some credibility for them stepping onto the board can be helpful in including them in the organization. Any thoughts or additions that you all would add to onboarding board members? Feel free to post a question, raise a hand, and jump into the conversation if you'd like. Okay. One of the things when in working with board members that I've heard a lot about that they greatly appreciate is being able to have that elevator pitch about your organization. And you providing that information is the ideal person to give them what they need to sound impactful and to sound ready to answer questions. So for example, a typical elevator speech, and you probably have one yourself as an ED, but when you're providing some data for your board members, give them a half-page bullets, what the organization actually does, the programs or the services, and what's the big deal with what the organization does? Why does it matter? Give them a few bullets on that. Let them be able to talk very succinctly about where you get your funding to make these things happen. And then some sort of statistics about the impact that the organization has had, some of their big key projects, or that some of the statistics on the projects that they are working toward that are going to impact the region. If you can provide this to your board members, you're better equipping them when they are out in their other roles to be able to speak specifically about what your organization does and create some of those partnerships and some of those bridges. If there's anyone out there that has created an elevator pitch or has worked with their board members on what's key in your elevator pitch, please feel free to jump in and let us know how you've done that and how it's been successful. The research also talks about it's our responsibility as EDs to communicate the goals of our organization to our board members explicitly so that they understand the direction and the focus for either the current year or the next 1 to 3 years, depending on their length on the board. If they know what their goals are, then they have a better understanding of what their role is and how to talk about the organization, how to be valuable to you and to your organization. They also, they're going to want to know what's the impact of hitting those goals and what their job is to help make that happen. You can also stay connected with your board members about informing them on different successes that the organization is happening and specifically where you're needing them to engage or specifically where you need them to reach out for your organization. Do any of you offer personal site visits to your board members? I know it depends on kind of the structure of your organization and where you're located in comparison to who your board members are. Some of the research recommends inviting your board members on site or out to the different programs where they get to potentially experience directly the work that you're doing. Do any of you offer personal site visits for your board members? The research would say that this is helpful not only in meeting the staff, but it really gives them a sense of the organization, of the culture. Getting to sit down and be part of some of the key staff can be very helpful. Think about how you have personalized the relationship that you have with your individual board members. I know that the first person that spoke out on this call mentioned that the previous ED had been really successful, and now she's stepping in to follow up from that success and wants to really create strong relationships with that board, just like her predecessor had. One of the biggest things that the research talks about in leadership in general is the importance of building trust to get results. And we can do that in a variety of different ways. Trust is built through character, demonstrating our character to people, our competence, how we get results, the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we have. And the third component of trust is benevolence, how we demonstrate respect or demonstrate caring, looking out for other people's best interests, other organizations' best interests, rather than just our own. And when we're personalizing the relationship that we have with our board, trust can be key. So character, competence, and benevolence. And the research lists some ways to personalize the relationships with people on your board. And it's really about, learning about them and connecting with them. Some EDs choose certain board members, different board members each time, to make specific contact with before and after board meetings. Some EDs report that they interview board members annually to get their perspectives on how things are going in the organization or how board meetings are being run. And others even collect special occasion dates of their board members, how many years they've been on the board, or birthdays, or if they have a child or a grandchild that's being born, checking in on that sort of thing, which is typical of what you would find out in business development when businesses are making a concerted effort, particularly with donors, to really get to know them well on a personal level. And then, of course, recognizing them for the contributions. If you read something out on a post or a blog or newspaper about one of your board members, really reaching out to them or bringing it up in the next board meeting to give them credit and demonstrate to others work that they're doing out of the community, even if it's not directly related to their service on the board. The research also talks about the importance of getting commitments from your board members as early as possible. What committees do you have, or what projects do you have that they may be interested in being in on, if there's any sort of financial commitment that they're making to the organization. Specifically becoming a fundraiser or gaining resources for the organization. It's also good to know how much time and investment the board member really plans on giving to the organization. Oftentimes we have certain expectations of people, and their expectations are very different than ours. And learning that up front can be valuable in knowing what to expect, because it also helps us understand how I might need to engage with this person differently to get them to invest more, or know that they're going to invest X amount, and how can I most wisely use the time that they're giving to the organization. Many executive directors talk very detailed ways to their board members about their strengths and their talents and what sort of role the board member would like to play as they serve. And that can be very helpful as well. The sixth way that the research talks about really engaging your board members is in running valuable meetings. Now, I know Michelle talked about the attendance, and Michelle, I'm guessing what you meant by that was, how do I get them to the board meetings? This slide is really about how to run the valuable meetings. How to get them to the meetings is a little bit different. The research would suggest that that's related to how engaged they are with their role, what kind of a personal connection they have with the ED, and that's probably, and of course, time and schedules and busyness. How many other boards or commitments they're on plays a role in how likely they are to attend meetings. I would be happy, by the way, to get on an individual phone call with any of you at any point in the next 30 days after the webinar if you'd like to troubleshoot or strategize on some of the unique challenges that you have in building your boards or in engaging your boards. I'd be happy to do that. The sixth piece that the research talks about in running valuable meetings is about engaging them beforehand so that they know when they show up to this meeting, what is this meeting really going to be about? What's the value out of this meeting? What am I going to be able to contribute in this meeting, or what am I going to get out of attending this meeting? Some ways for running valuable board meetings are listed out here. Any sort of pre-work, not that takes a ton of time, but maybe takes 20, 30 minutes, some sort of very poignant pre-work with key questions to have them give consideration to before they arrive at the board meeting can be helpful in preparation and kind of priming the pump. Of course, a meeting agenda, and if there are ways in which you want some of your board members to chime in on the conversation, that's going to be some of your pre-work before the meeting. Is really reaching out to them and saying, please note, this agenda item, I'd like to hear your perspective as it relates to XYZ. If you wouldn't mind taking 3 to 5 minutes to get that to us during the board meeting, that would be helpful. And that creates engagement. Of course, the technology, if you have remote attendees, and making sure that is working effectively. For all those that are in the meeting, depending on size, some people don't know each other. And when you have new members in there, it's really helpful for them to know the people in the room and know the names. It helps them to feel more engaged in the meeting and in the conversation. Rotating people allows different people to lead different sections of the meeting, and it creates engagement. Always taking things back to the goals, the purpose, the mission, or your vision for the organization or for the meeting keeps things not only on track in a board meeting, but it gives credibility to you as the facilitator of the meeting. People know and trust that then you can run this meeting and you can do it effectively. If you have statistics, any new statistics that you can bring in at the top of any board meeting that really demonstrates the impact, keeps or creates and keeps passion for board member engagement. A lot of people, when they're running any kind of meeting, but also board meetings, not only do they have an agenda, but they have a set time frame. And I've seen people prep their agendas where they say 10 to 15 minutes at agenda item 1. But some of the time and priority research shows that what's really more effective to write on your agenda is if the board meeting starts at 10, write on your agenda, this agenda item goes from 10 to 10:15. The next agenda item goes from 10:15 to 10:40, so that you're not having to calculate time while you're facilitating a board meeting. Some organizations and EDs send out post-meeting surveys after a board meeting to identify and take the temperature of what went well in that meeting. Some of the questions that you could ask in a post-meeting survey are things like the continue, start, stop framework. What would you say we need to continue in our board meetings that are most valuable to us getting results and sharing information? What should we start doing in our board meetings that would make them more valuable? And what should we stop doing in our board meetings that we just don't need to do anymore? That we're on a routine now and it's just not as helpful as it used to be. The framework of continue, start, stop is a great way to survey and determine meeting effectiveness. And then lastly, of course, documenting decisions that are made in the meeting. In case any of you ever have a board member or two that don't always speak concisely in your meetings and may kind of take over, what you'll notice when that happens in any sort of meeting, when someone takes over in a meeting, other people start to find other things to do, pick up their phones or start doing other things. And one of the frameworks that we use in our meetings is that we set up front in a meeting, even in our organizational meetings, is really giving a framework for how to engage in the meeting. And we challenge people that when you have information to provide on a point on the agenda, that we ask you to make your point, state your point up front in a sentence or two, give your rationale for making that point, give us your evidence, your data, your opinions for that, and then restate your point. And then that allows the conversation to be pushed forward, but it allows other people to chime in. And oftentimes what's difficult and why we sometimes talk more than what's necessary in a meeting is because we want to get everything out all at one time. And what the research tells us is that the listeners or the other audience members kind of stop listening after about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Somebody else wants to chime in and add something or disagree with something. And so this framework of prep allows us not only to speak concisely in a meeting and be heard, but it allows others to engage in that conversation, and it creates more interest and more interesting conversations in the meetings that we lead. This piece of research just summarizes the 8 best practices of what the research would call the most successful boards and their members. They suggest that the most successful boards have passion and actually do and behave based on the mission and purpose of the organization. And based on that, they make decisions that are focused on the mission and the purpose. They're contributing in meetings, and the relationships build, maintain, and restore trust. There's some sort of connection or potential engagement between meetings, not necessarily between all meetings. And they tend to be more of an activist for the organization's mission. The research also shows that board members who are activists for the organization's mission have an elevator pitch. And the ED has worked with them on what that elevator pitch sounds like so that they have the data that they need to speak about the organization intelligently and with passion. They're also able to communicate outside in the communities and other places that they serve how the organization actually is valuable, what it's been doing, how it does that, who it impacts. What questions do you all have, or what information best practices do you all use for engaging your boards? Let's open it up to any questions or question and answer session that you may have at this point.
So Monica, so we've got 2 comments from Laura Mathis. One of them was on the board challenges, and I didn't get to it before we moved on at the beginning. She says that a challenge for her is a board member who picks apart everything we do in a critical / not helpful way.
Okay. And
And
I'm assuming that happens in meetings.
she says yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Um, I don't know all that you've done, Laura, but I'm sure there's other people on this call that have had a very familiar situation. If so, I'd love for you all to chime in on some of the best practices that you've used for this. But let me just throw out a couple of options.
And Monica, real quick, she also adds that it makes others uncomfortable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can imagine that it does. I guess one of my first thoughts with that, if Laura and I were consulting, and I'm assuming other people have had some similar experience with this, is sometimes, believe it or not, sometimes when we have difficult behavior, we don't realize that we have it. And it may be worth having a conversation with the person offline just to ask about their experience being on the board and in the board meeting. And getting a little sense about where they're coming from and their take on things. The second thing that I would ask the person in that conversation is that I've had a few people come up to me and talk to me about the challenge of having conversations in the board meeting because of their approach in how they are looking at or dealing with the problems or the things that are presented. For example, and then give a couple of examples. I can imagine right now that some of you are thinking of your board member and saying, there's no way that I would ever do that, or that I could ever do that. And in response to that, what I would ask you is, what would be the main reason that you wouldn't be able to have a conversation with that person about that? Very often the person doesn't realize that they're doing that, doesn't realize that it's a problem. However, if they don't care that it's a problem, then as the facilitator of the meeting, I'm going to have to do some different things because I'm losing the rest of my board in that process and they're becoming more disengaged. And that's got to become more important than allowing that person to pick apart things in a way that is becoming destructive to getting results in the board meeting. So there's got to be a shift in that, the way that that is playing itself out in the meeting. Any comments or further questions related to that that would push this conversation a little bit forward or in another direction? So the two options with that type of a board member would be talking with them about that situation one-on-one when it's not happening. Option two is really facilitating that meeting differently. So for example, if Pat is the board member that's kind of picking things apart in the board meeting, one of the ways to deal with that in a group setting respectfully is to say, take it back to the goal, take it back to the purpose, take it out of the detail at which they're pulling it apart, or posing to them, putting them in the position to come up with a solution. So Pat, what are your suggestions? We've been talking about XYZ, and this doesn't seem, you're not responding to this piece, you don't seem to care for this idea, and you have found ways that this is not going to be a successful strategy either. So what are you suggesting? And I think sometimes giving them the opportunity to come up with a suggestion or a solution instead of identifying the problem can be helpful. Sometimes it's also identifying to people in a group setting, we've done a great job of identifying the problems here, but we've got a lot of expertise in this room, and what we need to identify right now are solutions. We're not necessarily all going to agree on that solution, but we need to come up with a solution that the majority of us agree with and can run with for, and of course, always taking it back to the mission, the purpose of the greater organization, so that you're removing it away, it's externalizing it from the people back to the purpose of the organization.
And Monica, Carlene Herring asks, can the board chair not help with that situation?
Yeah, depending on the setup of your board and the personalities on your board and the structure, absolutely your board chair could help with that. Sure. Unless that person is your board chair, and then that would be a different situation. But absolutely engaging your board chair. And other members. You could potentially engage other members if you were talking about it in a way that you would talk about it, even if that board member, who tends to be difficult, were there in the conversation. You wouldn't want to create any sort of inappropriate alliances or speaking in a way that you wouldn't speak around that board member. But my guess is that if you or a couple of other people have already recognized that there's a difficult behavior that's going on in a board meeting, it's usually not one person that notices it. There's usually a pattern of people that have noticed the behavior that derails the meetings. And that's really what we're talking about. You want to externalize it from the person to getting results in the meeting. And it's so easy to become really frustrated with people, but when we externalize it outside of the person to the goal, that helps kind of modulate emotions and reactions to that sort of challenge.
So Carlene added, especially if this is a quote, known conflict agent, just waiting for an opportunity to blow up on staff.
Absolutely. Yeah, so what's happening in that situation, I would guess, Carlene, is that there's a trust issue, right? People then start or stop speaking up in the meeting because they don't know how this person is going to respond, or they do know how the person is going to respond. And so there gets to be created a little bit of fear in that conversation. And so it starts changing what the conversation sounds like in that meeting. And some of these specific conversations or individual, the uniqueness of some of these, I would be happy to get on a call with you. Because I know sharing any sort of detail of it is not necessarily what you want to do in a webinar, but there are some things that we could potentially talk through in a 30-minute call that may be helpful to you. And I'd be happy to do that. What other questions or best practices do you all have about engaging your board members?
So we had a comment from Laura Mathis earlier when you were talking about elevator pitches. She says, if anyone has an example of an elevator pitch that can be shared, she'd appreciate it.
Oh. Yeah, does anyone on this call have an elevator pitch about their organization? So if you meet somebody, or if you and I were even going to get on a call, what would you tell me the first 2 minutes about your role in your organization? The research says the most effective elevator pitches happen in about 60 to 90 seconds. So they're not long, but they're engaging and they're compelling because they tell who you are, what you do, the impact of what's done at your organization, and there's a feel of passion for that when you're communicating it. I do know that YouTube's got some good elevator pitches. If you ever wanted to just type in best elevator pitches, they've got some good ones in there. They've also got really bad ones, but they've got some really good ones in there. And you'll know because you'll be engaged and you will have really listened for that 60 to 90 seconds to what that person was saying. And that gives some good data And what it does is it sparks a question from the listener. So if the person were to say, I run this organization and what we do is X, and we impact, our estimates are that we impact over 3,000 people per month by providing this, this, and that. The person who's listening to that will say, wow, I had no idea there was even a need for that. How did you get into that organization? And then that's what it does, is it creates some interest and some conversation. If anyone has an elevator pitch they'd like to share with us, please feel free. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of YouTube, but there are some good ones out there on YouTube. And I think you said Laura was the one that posed that question?
Yes, that's
And
correct.
Laura, I would be happy to get on a 30-minute call with you, Laura, if you want to talk through elevator pitch either for yourself or a checklist of items that you would like to give to your board members in informally coaching them on an elevator pitch that's a great fit for your organization. I'd be happy to do that. What other questions or best practices have you all found related to engaging board members? Okay, so I think we must be kind of at the end of the call. This last slide just really sums it up. If you engage people on an important and vital level, the psychology of it is they're going to respond. We connect with them in a way that's meaningful to them or that's compelling to them. Typically, they're going to respond in some way. And if I can ever help you with any of your best practices or challenges, I'd be happy to get on a 30-minute call with you and do that. Let me see if my contact information, there you go. You can see on this first slide our website, but all you have to do, my email address is monica@varietconsulting.com. And in our organization, what we do is leadership coaching and training and development, focused on getting results through people and through teams. So I'd be happy to just get on a quick call with you and answer any of your specific questions, or if you're wanting to apply anything that you got from this call or the conversation and slides in this call to your organization or your role, I'd be happy to do that for you. Feel free to reach out to me in an email.
And Laura has best practice to share, actually, here. So we can...
Great.
Yeah. She says, here's something we started that has helped in attendance. We send the board package the week ahead of the meeting, and then on the meeting day, I send an email to the board. This gives me a chance to highlight the agenda and encourage attendance.
Perfect. So a week out, send some documentation for review, and then day of, it sounds like, sends a reminder and some key points about the agenda. That's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, I guess if there are no more questions or comments, yeah, I just want to, again, on behalf of NADO and the NADO Research Foundation, I'd like to thank Monica for doing this webinar today, and I'd like to thank all of you for participating. Just a few quick reminders before we go. We have 2 more webinars coming up as part of our 2018 Professional Development Webinar Series. They are Communication Strategies and Public Relations Plans for RDOs, which will be held on September 13th, and Crisis Communications, Time to be both proactive and reactive, which will be held on September 20th. So for more information on those, please check out NATO's website. Also, this webinar has been recorded, and the password-protected recording will be made available to all of you in the next day or so, so keep an eye out for that email. And lastly, after this webinar concludes, you'll receive a prompt to complete a brief evaluation. So I hope you'll take a couple of minutes to do that. It'll help us immensely as we plan future webinars. So again, thank you, Monica, and thank you everyone for joining us, and hope you'll be joining us again very soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian, for hosting and for inviting me to participate, and I also appreciate you moderating the call and the questions. Thank you very much for doing that, and I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.
All right, thanks a lot. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.